Hi, and welcome to today's live discussion on battery storage. The future success of renewable energy and electric vehicles depends largely on the ability to store power. The good news is that the Consortium for Battery Innovation feels confident that the demand for battery storage will adequately meet supply. I'm Nicolette Pomba-Fonseo, editor of ESI Africa and co-moderator for today's discussion. Joining me to discuss current battery storage technologies and the market are Mikhail Nikomarov from Bushveld Energy, Dr. Thomas Hillig from TH Energy, Harry Greaves from Prospect Lithium Zimbabwe, and my co-moderator, Laura Cornish, Editor-in-Chief from Mining Review Africa. Before we start, please note that a recorded version of this webinar will be available for you to access on our websites. If you have any comments or questions for our panelists during the discussion, please type them into the Q&A box on the left-hand side of your screen. And welcome to everyone that has joined us today. So let's start the discussion with an opening statement from our panelists. Mikhail, to give an introduction, let's talk about the mining sector, which plays a key role in terms of being a large power user as well as contributing to generation capacity. How is the mining sector responding to the energy market changes?
Thank you very much, Nicolette. I think there are a number of ways that the mining sector is responding. I think it's important to realize just how much of a cost energy is for a typical mine. Somewhere between 20 and 30% is not atypical, and that's a large cost contribution. And so mines are looking at that from a point of view of how can they reduce their costs. And I think they're doing it a bit differently depending on what their geographical location. So in South Africa, where nearly all the mines are grid connected, cost is one contribution. The other part is security of supply. We've had a restart of load shedding earlier this year. We had quite a bit of load shedding a few years ago. So mines are trying to solve not only for the cost piece, but also for security of supply. They've been looking at fairly large solar installations because one of the benefits of solar is that we've got great sunlight almost everywhere in the country, not to mention the continent. So they're looking at that. They're not looking much beyond just the solar piece, so that only solves maybe 20%, 25% of their energy, and that's, I think, one opportunity for storage. If you look at mines that are not grid connected or are in weak grid environments, which is the case for most of sub-Saharan Africa, the energy costs are even higher. Those mines are usually running off of diesel or heavy fuel oil, depending on their size. So for them, it's not so much the security of the supply, it is really around getting that cost down and maybe creating some predictability in the cost, because both diesel and heavy fuel oil, they move as the commodity of the price of oil moves, so they're susceptible to those cost fluctuations. Putting in solar creates some predictability on the price, so that's quite important. But again, what we've seen primarily is people looking at solar only and to how to displace maybe 20, 30% of that thermal energy. The great opportunity is to build more solar or other types of renewables and add storage to it. So I think that's kind of the next step for the mining sector.
Well, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of background into the mining sector, and it's very interesting that they predominantly are located in weak grid environments. Thomas, just to take on looking at the environment, what are the key factors in the energy sector that are pushing the demand for battery storage, and why?
Yes, we have been following for quite some time the African markets regarding energy storage. I think we have written here and there also that a revolution was going on. At the same time, I have to mention it's a slow revolution. So we still see that many microgrids are built actually without storage. And in the end, a little bit what Mikhail was describing. In the mining sector, mining companies are doing the first step at the moment. They get familiar with renewables. They add solar only, sometimes wind only. And at this early stage, sometimes it's enough to see that renewables actually won't cause production losses. I think when mining companies, for example, are familiar with renewable energy solutions, they want to have more renewables. This will be the point when they need to consider storage. In some other industries, for example in hospitality, the situation is slightly different. Here we already see today flagship installations that run 100% on renewables plus battery storage, and diesel gensets are only used as backup. We speak here, I think, about African market from a market perspective. Nevertheless, I would say that from a global view, microgrids and powering off-grid off-takers still is a niche. I think the market will be much more driven by international developments, by e-mobility, by e-cars, and the demand will come largely also from outside of Africa.
Thank you for that response, Thomas. Harry, let's have a look at the types of minerals that are going to be important in the mining sector in terms of battery storage development. What can you share with us around that?
I think it's first thing to recognize, thank you, Nicole, is this is a very rapidly, very dynamic space, and a lot of things are changing. The storage market is going to be drawn to the availability of various resources, and primarily at the moment, lithium seems to be leading the charge, but there's a great move into developing batteries which are less reliant on cobalt, so that we're looking at some nickel, cobalt, manganese type cathodes coming forward. So there's a very dynamic environment out there. The old lead acid batteries still have a place in the market. The lithium batteries seem to be taking a great lead, particularly in the more in the storage markets which require mobility, and then the vanadium batteries are coming through very quickly as well. So nickel, cobalt, manganese, lithium, all of them are starting to become very, very key elements.
Thank you so much, Harry. You've mentioned quite a few elements there, but we have an audience question that we'd like to pose to all of our listeners, and you can respond to the survey by answering to one of these. But choose one of the 5 options on which type of battery storage technology do you think will dominate the market in the next 5 years. So whilst our audience responds to that survey question, we can continue with our discussion. So, Mikhail, let's talk about fixed versus mobility. Are these two very different in the technologies that are needed?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we actually think that maybe there's 3 ways to think about kind of the types of energy storage that's needed. Consumer electronics, which is probably the type of storage everybody's most familiar with in our phones, in our laptops. Then you've got what is used for mobility, and that's not just electric vehicles. You can also think about drones. Ships are also opportunity, but anything that trains. We usually think about cars, but it's some of these larger types of mobile infrastructure, and then stationary storage, which is fixed, used more for grid support, mini grids. I think there's various differences. So for mobility, what you need is less weight, and so you need energy density, and you really need an ability to kind of, especially for a car, to provide a lot of power instantaneously. Certainly, you need duration as well, but you maybe don't need lifetime, for example. So most times cars don't last for 20 years like grid storage does. So what do you need for grid storage? There the need for energy density is not as high. Maybe if people are trying to put batteries into their homes or into very dense urban settings, that there is some need for it, but it's not as important in terms of weight and energy density as it is for mobility. So that allows maybe other technologies more opportunity. Also lifetime. Usually when you do grid planning, you're talking about 10, 20 years. Even renewable energy such as solar and wind, these are designed to last for 20, 25 years. So there's a nice kind of alignment that can happen if you have long life assets from a storage point of view that kind of matches what a grid wants. And all of those impact what kind of technologies are able to play. Certainly for stationary storage, it doesn't have to be just batteries. We've got thermal storage, you can have mechanical types of storage, and the most popular way to store energy has been pumped hydro, which is really these massive dams. So there's a lot more options, I think, for stationary and grid type storage because you don't have this energy density and weight requirements.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. I would not have thought of drones in terms of energy storage, so thank you for bringing that up. Thomas, in terms of the energy sector, there is an energy revolution underway. What do you forecast for this market in terms of energy storage in the next 5 years?
We mainly look at the African market, so for us it's a little bit difficult to really give a global forecast. As I mentioned before, we think that Africa will rather play a niche role, an important role, but still, I think the main drivers are outside of Africa. Sometimes for some of our customers, we've done some calculations, and during the next 5 years, we think that the energy storage market, if e-mobility really will take off, might multiply by a factor of 7 to 8. But I have to admit, this is rather crystal ball and guessing at this time, as we are not having a picture of the full market. Regarding the African markets, I see really quite some dynamics. Also, first mining companies getting into storage applications, but then, as mentioned before, other sectors like telecommunication, like hospitality sector, also in rural electrification. So if we only talk about the markets in Africa, probably during the next 5 years, I would expect that the number is going up even more than by a factor of 7 or 8.
Thank you, Thomas. It's really something that we need to consider in terms of energy storage impacting on so many different sectors. So, Harry, let's talk a little bit more about the minerals and what are the different minerals that are needed for battery storage technologies, and are these in abundant supply?
Yeah, so let's focus on lithium is the one that we are currently developing a lithium asset. Lithium is got the highest energy density and is currently the sort of leader in certainly in the mobile battery sector. And there are various different. One thing I think to understand is that there are a lot of different lithium batteries that are currently in development. Now these take typically 5 to 10, sometimes 15 years to take from a laboratory application through into full production, but the lithium really is the leader in energy density at the moment. As I mentioned earlier, the other elements we see coming through very importantly are nickel, and I think there's going to be a real run on nickel sulfides in the near future. A lot of pressure on cobalt because cobalt is primarily, most of the world's cobalt resources are in the DRC, and that comes with a significant risk, which the supply chain is very nervous about. So they're working hard on getting away from the cobalt dependency, and then that's where the manganese comes in. So there are quite a few competing technologies out there to get away from where the supply chain is going to be constrained in the future. Again, as the other speakers were mentioning, it's part of that is also dependent on what is the application of the battery. So mobility batteries where weight is critical. Slightly different signature to some of the other sort of power banks that you'd use for grid stabilization and for house storage.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. It's nice that you mentioned the fact that the research and development behind it takes so long, and a lot of thought goes into these competing technologies, as you said. Let's talk about the cradle-to-grave market of battery storage and unpack the challenges in developing a sustainable battery storage market. Harry, let's see what is the expected lifespan for the current battery technologies in the market, and how can this be extended? Because I think that's very important.
Yeah, so most of the current batteries seem to be working on the product warranty seems to be running around a 10-year life cycle. This guarantee seems to look at a very decent efficiency rate at the 10-year mark. Tesla have got a 70% efficiency after 10 years, is what they're claiming, and they will part of their swap out of your purchase price of your Tesla is for a swap out in the 10-year cycle. There's quite a big a lot of emphasis being placed now on the recyclability of those batteries, which is a very interesting development. They're planning on 90 to 100% of the minerals in those batteries being recycled within the 10-year life cycle. So I think the one thing to look at here is the current expectation is 10 years. But there's also quite an interesting development in that the batteries can be used for different applications as they get to the end of their life cycle. So there is a company in the UK we're aware of that are swapping out the batteries out of the electric buses towards the end of their life cycle, and they use those to stabilize the power grid as the meaningful use in the battery changes. So this is such a dynamic market, such a dynamic area that I think what we understand is today the efficiency of the batteries, that is changing very quickly and will be very different in the 8 to 10 year cycle when they come to the end of their cycle.
Thank you so much, Harry. That I like to hear the fact that we can reuse and recycle these batteries. So, Thomas, as we increase battery storage in the field, what are the solutions around reuse and recycling, specifically around the energy storage for off-grid and mini-grid solutions?
Yes, we've seen a similar development as what Harry just described. Batteries, for example, in Germany, there's an application where batteries from electric cars are actually used then also for grid stabilization, mainly lithium-ion batteries. I think in general, whenever you have a certain technology out there in the field, the solutions will develop around. So, for example, lead acid. We already have a very high recyclability of lead acid batteries. In comparison to lithium-ion, this is pretty often given as an advantage. However, there are companies like Samsung who announced that they will go down to individual components actually and recycle the different components of a cell phone. So then there's Fortum, the Finnish company, that says on lithium-ion batteries that the recyclability will go up, or they've developed a solution that recyclability will go from 50% to 80%. I would actually rather expect reuse of individual components of a battery than using the battery for different applications. I think there will be certain exceptions to this rule, especially in lithium-ion. There's a certain risk of explosion. You have to know how the batteries were used before. So for that, it's important really to track the usage of the battery before. I'm also sure that certain solutions will be developed, but nevertheless, our estimation is that we rather see reuse and recycling around the different materials in the battery.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I think that is, as you say, very important with our waste areas increasing in size, rather to take every single element within the batteries and reuse them. So, Michael, let's talk a little bit more about the mining sector. How does this sector contribute to the sustainability of battery supply and demand and the cradle-to-grave aspect? Hi, Michael, are you there? It seems that we have lost Michael, so he can respond to that question perhaps later on. I'd like to now hand over to my colleague Laura Cornish, who will run through the survey response. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Nicolette, and thanks so much to our speakers for their interesting insight thus far. Before we continue with the discussion, I am going to share with you the results of our survey. And very interestingly, lithium and vanadium are our first and second position. We have lithium coming in at 49.2%, vanadium following closely behind on 59.6%, and then a significant drop for the rest of the technologies we mentioned. Sodium, nickel, and zinc bromide technologies at 4.7% and lead acid at 1.59%. So with those very interesting results, I'd like to open up again to my speakers to give their insights into the survey results. Harry, let's start with you. What do you think about the results?
Sorry, so Laura, I lost you a little bit there. Could you just repeat that?
Harry, let me just for the audience repeat the results of the survey. We had lithium coming in at 49.2%, vanadium at 39.6%, sodium, nickel, and zinc bromide at 4.7%, and lead acid at 1.5%. So, Harry, your comments on those survey results, especially showing that lithium is at the front of the survey results.
Yeah, I think that, look, that obviously that makes a lot of sense. Lithium has been getting a lot of the airtime because the rapid growth and the hype is currently around the electric vehicle market. You know, we've got rough numbers of about 1.5 million electric vehicles sold in China this year. In 2040, they're expecting 25 million cars to be sold in China alone per year. And all of that is driven because of the mobility. The lithium batteries are what's getting most of the publicity. I would expect that to be the case moving forward, although I do, this is definitely not an argument between the different technologies. They all have a very valid place. If this revolution is going to continue and meet the potential it has to change our signature on the planet, you know, all of these technologies are going to increase. But lithium certainly seems to be the forerunner, and I think as these batteries evolve, that is going to remain the case with this incredible development in electric vehicles.
Brilliant, Harry. Thank you so much for your insight. Thomas, your thoughts on the survey results?
I think they're not a very big surprise. I would have expected also lithium-ion leading the field, especially as Harry has just pointed out, the bigger importance of e-mobility during the coming years. For stationary or for small stationary applications, I still would expect quite some lead-acid batteries in the market. Not so much in the press, not so much in the public discussion, but because they are inexpensive, people are trained, are educated, know how to use them. Also, questions about importing lead-acid batteries I think they will still play a certain role during the next 5 years, even if they definitely won't be hyped as much as the other applications.
Excellent, Thomas. Thank you so much. Mikhail, if you didn't hear the survey results, it's very clear that vanadium and lithium are the front runners from our audience. So what are your thoughts on the fact that vanadium is believed to be one of the better battery technologies?
Yeah, and I'm hoping you can hear me now. We've had some technical difficulties, which I believe we've solved. Yeah, so I think it's also not surprising the results. I am quite happy to see that vanadium is up there. I think there might be a few more answers if we had a few more options there. So there's still, I think, some, especially on the stationary storage, where you do have a lot more options because of what I mentioned, that need for energy density is not critical. There could be, as a result, more options as to what kind of minerals are going to be needed. And I think even within the lithium space, it's the exact formulations. We call it a lithium battery, but it's probably more accurate to call it a nickel battery in terms of weight. So I think there's a lot more opportunities for different chemistries within that. We just called it a lithium battery, but even within that, there's actually at least 4 kind of leading permutations, depending on, again, what is the need. Is it a small vehicle, a large vehicle that has a bit more weight, or using lithium for stationary storage?
Brilliant. Mikhail, thank you so much for your insights. We're going to continue with the panel discussion now, and what I'd like to do next is really look at the pros and cons that vanadium and lithium have to offer the battery storage market. So Harry, let me start with you. Why don't you share your insights with me on what lithium does in terms of pros and cons for battery storage in electric vehicles?
So the big issue with lithium is lithium has the highest energy storage, and in addition, its cost per kilowatt hour is dropping very quickly. So the lithium batteries, as Mikhail mentioned, there are many different chemical combinations of lithium batteries, and as we keep mentioning, that is going to change over time. But if you look at the lithium batteries currently in 2010, they cost around about $1,000 per kilowatt hour. Now in 2019, that's down to $150 per kilowatt hour, 85% reduction. It's becoming the most efficient, lightweight storage mineral for the batteries, and these batteries are becoming more stable, and they're being able to extend the life of the battery in terms of its ability to produce energy. So until we don't see there being any major challenges to that in the mobile field in the short term. And lithium itself is in abundant supply. There's been a lot of exploration recently. There will be some supply deficits in the coming years, but there's a lot of exploration going on, and we expect. Well, there's a big deficit planned in the next 5 to 10 years. We think that supply will gradually catch up with that.
Harry, thanks so much. Mikhail, can you share with me the pros and cons from a vanadium perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this, again, kind of goes back to whether we're talking about mobility or stationary applications. So I think the big minus of any kind of flow battery is it uses a lot of water as part of the liquid electrolyte, which makes it larger and heavier, and thus intrinsically a bit difficult to work for vehicles, although there is a company that does claim to have a flow battery for mobility applications. Where the technology does have a strength is the fact that it doesn't degrade from use. So if you need a battery that can be used multiple times per day, that's great. If you need a battery to last for a long time, this is where flow batteries are extremely cost competitive. The other part of the cost comes in is if you want long duration. The great thing about a flow battery is that the energy and the power are completely independent from a design point of view. So if you need a 3-hour battery, a 4-hour battery, a 5-hour battery, 6-hour battery, the cost for the power remains the same for the membranes, and that's on the DC side. So we're not talking about power conversion systems. We're just talking about the DC block. So as a result, once you need more energy applications rather than power applications, when you need to time shift a lot of renewable energy, for example, from the middle of the day into the evening, into the early mornings, this is where the technology becomes cost competitive. It is not cost competitive for short duration, 15-minute, 30-minute applications, such as frequency control. And I think that's, as we're seeing a shift in grid uses of storage, going away from just frequency and more towards capacity, towards transmission distribution deferral, and towards multiple uses for one battery, this is where the market for flow batteries becomes a lot more attractive. And it was not the case a few years ago, but it is increasingly the case now.
Mikhail, excellent. Thank you so much. I think we understand from a mining context the importance of both of these minerals from a battery storage perspective. Let's take a look now at where we will see battery storage becoming the norm. Thomas, do you want to pick up on that question for me, please?
I think in vehicles, it's still a long way to go. If there are regulations, like for example in Norway, just to give an example, we will see batteries definitely as a norm. If the market decides, I think the consumers will tend to stick to petrol cars. So there I would not really expect batteries to become a norm. Having a look at e-mobility, the typical electric car is a second or car that is only used in a city. It could be, if the distance is increased, if you could go with an electric car also go to your holidays, take it over longer distance, either that the capacity of the battery is increased or that the infrastructure is improved and that you have faster charging infrastructure. I think if the rules of the game change, if they are different than today, we might see the effect if the market rules stay as they are today. Even if prices come down, I think many drivers will prefer their large SUV and with a motor that is roaring. I think here it's very important that legislation puts the right framework. Distributed energy, I think here a regulation is even more important. So in many countries, energy storage is not considered at all in the regulation. So you have to set incentives and for grid-connected installations above all. And you can use then batteries to replace grid extensions in certain areas, so to put batteries in a distributed way. If you are then completely off-grid, so distributed energy meaning off-grid, I think the investment costs are still very important. So as long as you have to increase your investment costs considerably by adding storage, it will be a rather slow development. For example, if you are an independent power producer and if you want to invest in a renewable energy assets providing electricity to a mine, let's say you can do 5 megawatt without storage, and then if you want to go increase the renewable energy plant at a remote mine, if you want to go from 5 to 10 megawatt, you need an extra storage. So the IRR on the first 5 megawatt will be much better because you only have to invest into renewables and not into storage. So from the point of view of an external investor, actually the capex will remain very important of energy storage systems, and harvesting the low-hanging fruits, I suspect, will be of going for low penetration renewable energy systems in off-grid applications for quite some time, unless the regulator sets the right framework conditions. For example, carbon taxes or certificates for certain areas.
Thomas, thank you for such an in-depth insight to that question. I'd like to ask the same question to Harry. Harry, your thoughts on where we will see battery storage becoming the norm? I do believe we've lost Harry. I'm going to move on to the next question then.
Oops, sorry, I'm back.
Why do you think there are still so many... Harry, did you have a question?
I did. Sorry, I'm back. It's a really fascinating part about this whole revolution we're in. When we started looking for finance for our project in 2016, the projections for the lithium market were very modest, and they've exceeded that by about 30 or 40 times since we started. And if you look at the projections for vehicle sales, just in China, for example, the graph is almost exponential. So very hard to know exactly when that tipping point is going to arrive. But they're estimating 2045, 31 million cars sold annually in China. This year, the new BYD, little BYD 1 is sold over 10,000 units in January already. I think it's going to happen. Our view is it's going to happen sooner than we think, and the interest we are seeing on the offtake side from the vehicle manufacturers out of Europe and China is extremely strong. While these guys are all trying to lock in supply and guarantee themselves some product, and the pressure is becoming more and more on us to look at beneficiating these products and producing the hydroxides, which give greater price reductions in the production of the battery, moving away from the carbonate. So we're not seeing any slowdown in the demand. It just seems to be ramping up continuously. Very difficult to put a date to it, but it is. We see it's just so aggressive in our space at the moment.
Excellent, Harry. Thanks so much for those insights. I have one last question, and I would like to address that to Mikhail first. Mikhail, considering the demand for battery storage is so high, why do you think there are still so many microgrids without storage?
Look, that's an excellent question. I don't have a full answer. I have a few hypotheses. I think one issue is just awareness. I don't think that a lot of customers and also developers have really been thinking about storage. Even renewable energy has taken a while for people to understand, and they're just wrapping their heads around, how solar profiles, wind profiles work, how to connect, look at that versus a customer profile that would be the load on the mini grid. Adding storage to that is a whole new set of complexities. So I think awareness is one. I think there's still a mindset that technology costs are where they were 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So people are thinking that they're using data that is not that old, but in the realm of energy storage, it's almost generations old. Someone had mentioned that every 18 months this sector is almost changing and rebirthing, things like that. So I think that the awareness is one. Second is I think there's regulatory either bottlenecks or in some cases a lack of incentives. I mean, why are people installing so much solar? Because they're getting tax credits. Why are people buying electric vehicles? It's because the government is making them more affordable by being able to take out a large chunk of the cost off of your taxes. If that wasn't there, and in fact we're seeing that as those subsidies come out in the U.S. and in China, demand slows. That hasn't been applied to storage. It hasn't been treated in the same way. It hasn't been treated as efficiency. It hasn't been treated as renewable energy. So as a result, there's not an additional financial incentive that has been there for other things like EVs and solar. And I think another part is also the fact that, similar to renewable energy, you're paying for the battery up front. You're getting the benefit over 5, 10, 15, 20 years. That's a very expensive proposition, regardless of how much the battery costs. the way that has been addressed in renewable energy is the ability to finance. So once lenders and financial institutions are able to kind of understand that storage has been de-risked from a technology point of view, from a safety point of view, and from a performance point of view, then that will also increase adoption. At the moment, you could probably finance a mini grid with just solar or wind. It's going to be a lot harder for the lender to then add storage to it, but I think that's going to change in the very near future.
Mikhail, thanks so much. Thomas, would you like to weigh in on that question for me?
Yes. Out there in the field, I actually see that many decision makers were risk adverse. So really understanding different battery technologies caused quite some problems. And this is also why at this rather early stage, at least for large scale off-grid applications, I think decision makers said, okay, let's just go for the first step and let's go for solar or for wind in some cases only. Then the points I mentioned before, investment costs, there is substantial additional investment of doing renewables plus battery. If you want to reduce diesel costs, cutting out just a slight portion of diesel consumption by renewables brings a higher IRR than actually coming up with more ambitious plans. And if you are the decision makers and if you have any doubt that the battery, for example, won't work, you probably prefer to not do step 1 and 2 together because in the end it could be a risk to your job if then a battery causes production losses. On the other hand side, we see more and more project examples that prove that you work with companies that are experienced, that the integration of battery does not cause production losses, and that there are actually additional benefits of adding batteries to microgrids. So that means at the same time, the more references we see in a particular industry, for example in mining, the more likely it is that companies do step 1, renewables only, and 2, renewables plus battery at the same time.
Excellent. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for such an insightful panel discussion. We have a huge number of questions from our audience, so I'm going to delve straight into that. And I'm going to start with a very interesting question, which I'd like Thomas to answer. Thomas, the question is battery storage really the way forward for off-grid solar systems given the exorbitant cost and the short lifespan?
So there are two statements already in the question. So that the lifespan is short, and that really depends on the individual application. In off-grid applications, for example, it depends really for what you use the battery, and of course also what type of battery you use. Typically, in off-grid, you use different technologies than in electric vehicles. Actually, you need more cycles. So I would not say if you go for the right technology for a specific application that the lifetime necessarily is short. And we will get more and more data about the actual lifetime of batteries when they are used more in off-grid applications. And then also the point regarding costs. One of the other speakers has already mentioned it. The costs are coming down rapidly. So It's additional cost, definitely, but you have extra value also by integrating batteries. And I think it's a gradual approach. We won't see that there really is a turning point, that from one moment on the whole market flips towards batteries. I think it's a slow, gradual thing, and in off-grid applications especially, we will see many batteries. Similar for weak grid applications, where actually the main question is not really addressed by renewables only. So if you have concerns regarding the reliability of your business, solar and wind are not completely reliable. So the wind is not always blowing and the sun is not always shining. So in the end, it is more the battery that brings reliability, or the combination of renewables and the battery. So I think all these are indications that the markets are really driving towards batteries. But it won't be from today to tomorrow. It's a long and gradual process.
Thomas, thank you so much. Mikhail, we do have a lot of interest on the vanadium side of things, so the next question I'm addressing to you. Mikhail, with the publicity surrounding a number of notable fires as a result of the thermal runaway effect of lithium batteries, what is the industry doing to mitigate this issue? Isn't there a sense check needed by the industry to recognize the suitability of vanadium reflux flow batteries for large-scale, long-duration installations, rather than getting the square peg of lithium to fit that round hole?
Well, yeah, so it's a loaded question. I think I want to focus on the safety part of that because it's a topic that I think hasn't really been discussed at length. And I think when people think about lithium batteries, they kind of know the fire issue. You know, you're not allowed to bring the batteries on planes. There's a lot of kind of photographs and videos of cars lighting on fire. But again, you know, cars have petrol in them, so we all kind of live with those risks. I think the issues on storage safety is that the size of these batteries is much larger, and the number of people who could potentially get hurt is also much larger, especially if you start thinking about putting in batteries into your homes or into skyscrapers or in any kind of urban setting where, where inhalation is actually a major risk. Likewise, any fire you have at a substation where a lot of batteries are likely to be located can damage other equipment and create massive fires. In California, we've seen that a fire can actually bankrupt an entire utility. And so this question of safety has really never really been covered. I haven't seen an RFP that says, please give us your safety record. Please tell us how many fires or other types of, or injuries has the battery caused at any of your installations. That's we're still a little bit in that wild west of energy storage. I think that does create an opportunity for technologies that just are inherently safer from a fire point of view, and it's certainly flow batteries are true for that. Other types of mechanical storage as well, such as flywheels. The question is, how do you value that, right? We know very well now how to value the cost of a battery. We're getting very good at modeling out what is the value that a battery creates. These other aspects are still on that frontier. If you were to get insurance, for example, and you could cover, a $2 or $3 billion lawsuit, what would that cost? Is that required for every single location? Is that different from some technologies versus others? In my opinion, it should be. And if you're a customer and you're thinking, well, this risk is just covered by a warranty. No, the warranty is going to cover the risk of the battery. It's not going to cover the risk that this battery is going to create damage to other equipment, hurt or possibly even kill people. And this is, I think, a discussion that the storage industry needs to have. And it's a risk. It's not only a risk to specific technology, it's a risk to the entire industry. Because once, it's perceived as being dangerous, all of a sudden everybody just becomes even more risk averse. And as we just heard, that risk aversion is one reason why there's kind of more traction in renewables and less traction on storage. We don't want people to become, and developers and customers to become risk averse. We want them to just understand the risks. These risks must be in the open, and there must be a way to price them.
Mikhail, thanks very much. That's indeed very interesting. Harry, my next question from the audience is addressed to you. And the question states that there has been talk about vanadium being used in conjunction with lithium batteries. Do you have any comment regarding what additional applications or benefits this approach will have over standard lithium batteries?
Laura, I don't actually. I've got very little knowledge of how vanadium and lithium are working together, other than to say I know there's a tremendous number of new combinations of batteries coming out, but the role of vanadium in that I don't have much idea on. Mikhail may be able to help us with that.
Do you have maybe some more insight into that question?
Yeah, I mean, look, we have to understand that these types of formulations are in the R&D phase. You know, there's another question someone had asked about solid state. So these types of alternatives are at least 5 years away from commercial deployment. But basically, vanadium is used as a substitute for cobalt in the cathode. There are some benefits, including the lithium battery becomes it lasts longer, and the energy density also improves further. There's a couple of automotive vehicle companies that are kind of researching this. It's always a little bit difficult to tell how close or how away they are, whether it's kind of spin and marketing versus reality. But I mean, you can get, you know, these little coin batteries that have, you know, lithium silver oxide. Panasonic makes those for watches and for heart monitoring and heart control devices. So definitely this has been used. To see it applied in, you know, at a specific manufacturer OEM of electric vehicles, while I think that is a possibility, and there's certainly a lot of work going into it, it's not something we're going to see in scale within the next 5 years.
Brilliant, Mikhail. Thanks for your insight on that. Thomas, I had a question that sort of touches on the softer side of the issue, and the question states, what do you think the socio-economic impacts of off-grid microgrids will be in places like Africa and remote regions, perhaps such as the DRC?
Sorry, could you please repeat the question? I did not, the last part. Sorry, I did not get that question. Could you please repeat it?
No problem, Thomas. What do you think the socio-economic impacts are of off-grid or microgrid technologies in remote areas such as Africa?
Yeah. So I think in the question there was the example of DRC. Electrifying, in general, rural areas is also bringing at the same time a socio-economical benefit. At the same time, I think that in the development community, there is sometimes also a little bit the point, if you bring electricity to areas that have not been electrified before, everything goes automatically. Then villages basically step up the energy ladder automatically. First, they have lights, then they can read in the evening, they can do their homework, and then they will all be entrepreneurs. I think the story is a little bit more complicated. Electricity in these off-grid areas is important, but actually quite some development work has to be done at the same time. If the supply chain is not really in the country, so we talk more about indirect effects than that you really have all along the value chain benefits in a country like DRC. So if mining is in the country, of course, it depends then how is mining organized. Is mining organized in a way that the population benefits really? Who is installing actually the mini grids in these countries? Is it done by local companies? Are people trained in these countries? Do they really learn about renewables and energy storage, or do they only are they only cheap labor So I think all these factors play an important role to do a final assessment. What are the factors, the soft factors, and the impacts around storage, off-grid storage, and mini-grids and microgrids. So it's a very complicated question, and these were some aspects.
No problem, Thomas. Thank you so much. Harry, I do have a good lithium technical question for you, and that is asking, what is the minimum acceptable grade of the lithium deposit to mine prior to beneficiation?
Okay, so that's a couple of parts to that, to answer that. First is to understand there are primarily four main lithium, commercial lithium minerals. There are about 12 lithium minerals that exist. Four of those are your primary economic minerals. Spodumene is the best known and the most sought after for the chemical industry. Then there is petalite is the second most important. Now, most people will not be aware, but petalite is a 4% lithium in its concentrate form, and that is used primarily in the glass and ceramics industry, and that accounts for about 25% of the world lithium market currently. Interestingly, we have the biggest petalite deposit, JORC-compliant petalite deposit in the world. So it's a very poorly understood market, and that you need to have it around 4% with ultra-low iron, which means less than 0.1% iron to be suitable for the glass and ceramics industry. It can be used for the chemical market as well, but it's primarily used for glass and ceramics. The spodumene at 6% that can have iron up to but over 1%. I see some of the spodumene produced around the world does go a little bit higher, but that creates a few problems. Taking that back into the ore reserve, you would need it depending on your location. So you're primarily, it's a bulk mineral, so you're producing hundreds of thousands of tons a year, and that primarily gets shipped to China for your conversion. So distance to market is critical. Cost of mining is also very important. So you can't go simply on grade, but it'll be somewhere between 1.1 and 1.3% of most of the current hard rock lithium deposits in the world that are being mined.
Harry, thanks so much. We are getting to the end of the hour, but I do have time for perhaps one or two more questions. Mikhail, I have a question for you around the price of vanadium. And the person is asking and noting that the price of vanadium is very volatile. So at what price for vanadium do you consider the vanadium battery to be economic?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it was one that was probably more important a few months ago when vanadium hit maybe a 10-year price high. Prices have come down and kind of stabilized since then. But I think it's important to realize, one thing we didn't get to talk about is, there was a question that around what are some of the mining companies doing to make more, the industry more sustainable. The one thing you can do with vanadium is you don't have to sell it outright, because unlike other technologies, the other battery technologies, the vanadium electrolyte and thus the vanadium itself do not degrade over the usage of the battery. You can actually not only recycle it, you can actually completely reuse it. And so that creates a model where you don't have to sell the vanadium, you can actually rent it out. And we've seen that in the platinum space in oil refineries. And it's a very interesting opportunity to massively reduce the cost and in a way also defray the cost impact of vanadium. So if you're able to do it, there's almost a limitless price. I mean, even maybe not limitless, but I think even if prices of 3 times what they are today, we've seen that I think we can make the business case work. Certainly, the lower the price, even the rental becomes cheaper. At prices today, the battery is competitive. Around $40 per kilogram, you're going to be looking at $200 per kilowatt hour, 250 maybe of the vanadium alone. That's higher than the cost of a lithium cell at the moment, so that's not sustainable, but it's competitive today. The question is going to be, can that be competitive in 5 years? And the problem is that the vanadium piece will not change that much in 5 years, so there has to be a way to take the vanadium price out of the vanadium battery without taking the vanadium out itself.
Excellent. I think because we've got just 30 seconds, Mikhail, so one more question because we have so much interest in vanadium. Mikhail, can you tell me about lease options for VRFBs?
Well, I guess it's a question of lease as the battery, or lease as just the component of the electrolyte. I think lease options for batteries, if you treat a battery as equipment, you can get financing for that from almost any kind of company. Again, maybe for 5 years, something like that. It's an equipment loan, and that was the point around our banks able to finance this. I think the interesting thing about vanadium is the ability to rent out over a 20-year period or a 10-year period the electrolyte itself, which at the moment is somewhere between 30-40% of the battery's cost. And like I said, in 5 years, it will probably be closer to 80%. So the ability to take that out is really the only way that the technology can be competitive with the continued cost decreases that lithium is going to continue to incur due to economies of scale. But this is a way that we can take what historically has been a negative to the technology, the over-reliance on a single mineral, and actually make it a strength, because we can take out a lot of the capex. The remaining piece of the capex we can put into OPEX, thus making a lot more attractive. And this is a product that is already out there on the market. Again, there's just a timeline to adoption from when something comes out and when it's actually massively deployed.
Mikhail, thanks so much. We don't unfortunately have time for any more questions, but I'm sure our speakers will endeavour to answer all of those that did come through today. So in closing, on behalf of ESI Africa and Mining Review Africa, we want to thank our panelists for their contribution and expertise, and also to our guests for tuning in to gain valuable insights into a topic that is gaining worldwide interest and momentum. I'd like to remind you that a recorded version of today's discussion will be available for you to access from the Mining Review or ESI Africa websites. Until next time, goodbye.